My name is Nada Al-Mjdoud, and I am the Performance Management Executive Vice President at OCP. Welcome to Growing Needs, Fertilizer in Complex Times. It is our hope that today's session will help us all to understand the current challenges facing global fertilizer supply, how this impacts our food systems, and share ideas on how we can address these challenges. We look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists and to having a productive discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome. And ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon to you. It is my great pleasure to talk to you about the work of our industry, fertilizer industry, in changing times. And I would like to give my big thanks to the host, to OCP, for being our great member, being our partner in many initiatives, and for the invitation to this event. So let me start a little bit about my company, the International Fertilizer Association. It is the only global fertilizer association bringing together more than 400 members with a very simple mission: to promote the efficient and responsible production, distribution, and use of plant nutrients. This mission plays a critical role in helping to feed the world sustainably. And I can't see any better mission than helping to feed the world sustainably today. In the last 2 years, as many of you know, our industry performed exceptionally well. Agricultural markets were strong in 2020 in the face of COVID-19, with many governments around the world putting a renewed emphasis on food security. This was combined with already low global stocks of grains and edible oils, which have now fallen consecutively year over year since 2017. And this tight market in crops spiked prices in 2020 and following all the way to today, which we'll talk about. And this is after several years of reasonable stability. So what happened to fertilizers? Fertilizer prices increased on the back of the strong demand for crops, and this has intensified further in 2021 due to supply disruptions. And these disruptions only got worse today. The escalation of agricultural prices has mirrored rapid inflation across major commodity markets, from energy to freight, and many of these sectors clearly overlap with the fertilizer market. So this is the time to talk about challenging environment, because indeed the environment in the world, not just for our industry, but for all, is extremely challenging. So these compounding factors that I try to outline have drastically altered the fundamentals of the fertilizer markets over the past 12 to 18 months. So let us look quickly at the global food supply, because that's where it all starts. COVID-19 was a standout event in 2020, and it prompted fears of insufficient food supplies. This led many governments to support domestic agricultural production and facilitate food and feed imports. In 2021, continuing through COVID, governments continued to place emphasis on food security thanks to quick policy actions, and we are very grateful for that. And in the medium term, we expect government support to essential goods to continue. And it is not only food per se, it is also feed, as in animal feed. Feed consumption was supported by imports from China, which has been rebuilding its swine herd after it was greatly reduced by the African fever in 2019. And in particular, Chinese demand for feed was met by increased soybean output from major suppliers. And this is a trend that again is likely going to continue, especially for South American exports into the future. And of course, firmer crop prices have encouraged demand for fertilizers. Disruptions, they are all around us. And what I have to say is that these disruptions, they multiply. And IFA, as an industry association, needs to understand well what is happening around us and how to help manage those transitions for our industry. So let us start with the physical disruptions to global supply, and there are plenty. There are a number of the weather-related events, especially in late summer of 2020, and that continued throughout 2021. We have seen some shutdowns in the US Gulf region where we had a series of strong hurricanes, and this season is predicting even more hurricanes. Add on top of it the conflict in Ukraine, shutdown of the Black Sea ports, refusal of major shipping companies to carry Russian cargo, and you have a recipe for disaster. Moving on to the economic supply disruptions. These have been most severe in the nitrogen market. A tight energy market that we have has led to soaring energy prices, with the situation being particularly challenging in Europe, where prices have reached all-time high in recent months for energy. And with Russian gas either not delivered or refused to be taken, or at a high price, or as we heard today, not delivered, we have major part of Western European nitrogen industry under sizable strain. And last but not least, let us touch upon geopolitical disruptions. It's important to say that global trade of agricultural commodities remains far more liberalized than in the past. However, several recent government decisions have affected both agriculture and fertilizer trade. Some countries are limiting exports to protect their domestic supplies, such as China, Russia, and Turkey, and that leads to political tensions leading to trade measures. And one of the most significant geopolitical disruption in the fertilizer market, if we look at 2021, it has been sanctions on Belarus, and in 2022, it's the war in Eastern Europe. So when we started talking about challenges, we indeed have extremely challenging marketplace. And as I mentioned, it's geopolitics, it's economy, it's the remnants of COVID-19. And we have to find a good way to lead this industry going forward. So let's talk a little bit about restrictions, further restrictions that we have on our industry and on the related agriculture industry. In June of 2021, the European Union agreed to impose sanctions on specific sectors of the Belarusian economy, including potash. And the sanctions have wider implications because most exports from Belarus transit through a port of Klaipėda in Lithuania, which is part of the European Union, in order to reach the Baltic Sea. And so today's restrictions, when you think about Belarus, have far-reaching consequences all the way to Brazil, all the way to the soybeans that eventually end up as an animal feed in China. We are living in a globalized world, whether we like it or not, and disruptions in one part of the world echo throughout the rest of the world. We also have restrictions on fertilizer exports from several countries because a number of countries said, okay, if I can't get it in the world market, I'm going to protect what I'm going to have. So we've seen China, Russia, Turkey, and others. And effectively, very little fertilizer cargo is currently leaving the Russian ports, as Black Sea ports are mostly closed and shipping lines stop loading in a number of those ports. And 3 out of 4 large Russian fertilizer companies have sanctioned shareholders, though some have divested now. And there are a few companies that are still willing to handle Russian cargo. So our industry is at a crossroad. After outperforming the expectations of COVID-19 pandemic, the focus is now shifting to fertilizer affordability and availability, and whether this will have an impact on consumption and ultimately on food security in the coming year, or in the coming years, as the case may be. At the same time, there are many opportunities in our industry. Our role in feeding the world, both now and in the future, has a significant impact on agricultural development, on human health, and also on sustainability. Sustainability is an important issue to our business, the business of feeding the world sustainably. Last year, our members of IFA, asked us to form a sustainability committee that has, among other priorities, the decarbonization of the production side, CO2 reduction initiatives, and sustainable nutrient use programs. We see sustainability as an opportunity to create value for businesses, for communities, and for the environment. But our business doesn't stop there. We have an essential role to play in securing global food supplies. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine has a significant impact on that supply. Russia and Ukraine are major producers and exporters of staple grains, including wheat, maize, and barley. And Russia, together with Belarus, is a large producer and exporter of fertilizers. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat, and Ukraine is the 5th largest. And they are both major producers and exporters, accounting for about 26% of the global wheat exports, 23% of barley exports, 15% of maize, as well as a significant value for pulses, meat, and horticultural products, all of those needed to achieve diet diversity and proper nutrition all around the world. Ukraine conflict also affected the interlinkages between food, natural gas, and fertilizer markets. Natural gas is used both as a feedstock and energy source in production of ammonia, which is a base material for nitrogen fertilizer. Natural gas accounts for 70 to 80% of the ammonia production cost, and rapid increase in gas prices translated immediately into cost of other inputs. Energy is food, and there is nothing like today highlighting that energy is food. Energy is food, and fertilizer is how the translation of energy prices shows up on our table, on our plates. When you look at countries that are currently that's company currently sanctioned, Belarus provides something like 21% of global supplies of potash. And the latest crisis just adds to the disruptions in fertilizer supply chain that I talked about just a couple of minutes ago, which were due to COVID-19. Restrictions in fertilizer trade are magnifying this damage. So if you take the current environment and disruption and you layer it with policies and you layer it with restrictions on trade, you're going to get consequences to food prices and eventual food crisis. Consequences on food prices this year and the next 2 years, we assume, will be widespread and will arise from two factors. One is the increase in agriculture production cost due to more expensive inputs, and the reduction in production in the next crop cycle due to reduced access to fertilizers. The near-term focus needs to be on making sure sufficient fertilizer and other farm inputs are available. The current conflict in Europe has three impacts on food and nutrition security so far, and we all need to be very cognizant of it because this is a definition of a changing world. It's a significant rise in global prices of food, fuel, and fertilizers. It is concerns about availability of key food items and fertilizers, even in markets not normally supplied by the Black Sea region, and for commodities other than wheat, such as oilseeds, for example, and maize. And well-meaning policies, which are meant to protect some countries, but unfortunately have the opposite role of distorting the global markets. So this is putting pressure on private agribusiness companies. The rise in spot prices of commodities and inputs has resulted in higher financing needs for agribusiness companies. And as a result of some recent issues in some of the commodity trading companies, several banks had pulled back from their exposure. They curtailed their exposure to those commodity sectors. And while commodity prices are increasing, which should be logical that they should be financed, availability of financing to support resultant higher value commodity flows is declining. So when you pair all this with the withdrawal of a financial institution from this sector, it creates substantial gaps in a market. So let us talk briefly about most affected countries and where we are going to see the biggest impact of the current crisis. At IFA, we looked at countries that import main food commodities from the affected regions, and we looked at percentage of calories that those countries spend on, say, wheat. And so, for example, Egypt, wheat imports are heavily concentrated from Russia and Ukraine, and wheat accounts for 35% of daily calories in Egypt, which means that it's going to be one of the countries quite affected by the current issues. But we're also seeing other countries, and in the region where OCP operates, Africa and elsewhere, we are seeing stress in Yemen, we are seeing stress in Mozambique, Lebanon, Kenya, Angola, Nicaragua, Dominica, basically smaller countries in the Caribbean and a number of countries in Africa. And if you look at poor countries, they are particularly vulnerable. Yemen imports something like 95% of its wheat, and 20% comes from Russia and Ukraine. And wheat and bread typically makes about half of daily calories. So this is the logic to assess what's happening in our changing world. So in short to medium term, what I want to highlight is that our industry has a global footprint and a global impact. And if you move one part of the system, it's going to have an impact on everything else. Impediments to fertilizer availability will be felt globally, potentially reducing food supplies by September, October of this year, and seeing price rises for wheat and oilseeds that can be expected to spread to other food commodities. So what is IFA's role? What is my association's role in this changing environment? I'm very proud to say that we have a seat at the table, the big table, the United Nations Global Food Security Working Group, where we are working under the directions of the UN Secretary General to provide data on plant nutrients, to provide data on hotspots where fertilizers and food will be missing going forward, but most importantly, help provide solutions to solve the crisis that we have today, which is a global food crisis. Our industry came a long way, and we have a solid voice in global conversations. And companies such as OCP and other strong members of IFA, we work together to bring solutions to help feed the world sustainably. I'm going to close with, there is nothing like the time today where we can do both roles simultaneously. We can help feed the world, which is the changing paradigm in the title of this webinar, and we can do so sustainably because that is the order of the day. Thank you, and back to you, Nada.
So the question from the chat is to you, Elzbieta, is can you talk about the timing of the Russian fertilizer export restrictions and the different waves of those restrictions?
This is a very rich question, Nada, and we at IFA are striving for as free a flow of goods as we possibly can achieve given the geopolitical circumstances of the world. What is really important to say is that fertilizer companies are actually not sanctioned in Russia today. Some of the shareholders are, but companies are not. And that is very clear confirmation that fertilizer is absolutely essential to help feed the world. And I was very happy to see that we have seen even United States OFAC allowing for trade flow of fertilizers. So what I want to say is that two things actually. One is that the world is realizing how important our product is. This is not a nice to have. This is absolutely essential to have. And we have seen a number of examples what happens when we don't apply fertilizers. So the first thing that we ask is to ask our scientists, what happens if I skip a year, or if I skip a season in application? In some fertilizers, you're going to miss 10, 20%. In some fertilizers, you're going to miss more, 30, 40% of the yield. And we are seeing real life example in Sri Lanka, where fertilizer has been missing for about 8 months now, and we see what happens there. The second part I want to mention, Nada, is that it's about flow of product, but it's not just that. It's about the opportunity to have a conversation at the global table of feeding the world, because our industry is absolutely essential and needs to have a voice at the table. And I think with partners such as yourselves and others in the industry, we need to be vocal about what it takes to feed the world and why we succeeded up until now to feed 7 billion people, and what it takes to feed extra 3 that we're going to have in the next maybe 3 decades.
So in May, as you know, the US, chaired by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, hosted a ministerial meeting at the UN to mobilize action around key objectives to address and mitigate the worst impacts of the global food crisis. And this meeting resulted in a roadmap for global food security call to action, which calls for, and I quote, increase fertilizer production, support fertilizer innovations, and promote methods to maximize fertilizer efficiency, invest in diversifying sustainable production of fertilizers, and increase the use of residues as fertilizers to create longer-term supply chain resilience for this key input. Can you tell us what are some fertilizer innovations that can be utilized now to address the current crisis?
Nada, that's a great question. There is no better time than now to think about how best to use the fertilizer that we have available. Why? Because of affordability and because of availability. I just returned from Chile, where I visited a blueberry farmer. And that blueberry farmer was telling us that she is picking a row that looks the best and only fertilize that because she doesn't have enough and it's expensive. And so she's picking the best. And she's applying it in tiny quantities, just precisely what needs to be done. What is it? It's a precision agriculture practiced on a small farmer plot in the middle of Chile on blueberries. But that process is repeated day in and day out. Farmers are thinking how best to use the fertilizer, how to make sure that we don't have runoffs, how to make sure that whatever you apply actually gets used by the plant to grow. And so that takes us to innovations, and there are plenty of those in our industry, whether it's a slow release, whether it's a coated fertilizer, whether it's fertigation, for example, which economizes not only fertilizer, but water as well. But we also have to talk about recycling of nutrients and what it would take, and there are some new technologies on that. So, when things are cheap, it's kind of hard to say, well, I'm going to save this and that. But when things are pricey and not available, this is the best time to actually promote innovation in our industry. And I'm actually very pleased to see that this is a very fertile, pun intended, very fertile space. There is a number of companies that are reaching out to us at IFA and want to be members and want to pitch those innovations to you, the large companies in the industry. And I do hope that this crisis that we have, the global food crisis, is actually going to enable a lot more innovation. And yes, that statement from Secretary Blinken was extremely relevant to our industry. I think we need more investments. I think we underinvested in the past few years, and we need to use our product efficiently and really reach for nutrient use efficiency to the best nutrient use efficiency that we can get given the current technologies.
Dear audience, it's my opportunity to bring to you some of our observations at OCP about the growing needs for food and for fertilizers. First, let me say that it is profoundly saddening that violence has been one of the reasons for some of these challenges, and our hearts go out to all those affected by conflict. We said that we would speak today about fertilizer in complex times, and it is true that these are extremely complex times. We have heard already about growing needs, both on the African continents and elsewhere in the world. Alberta mentioned Asia, for example, and the global, I want to say, world in general. The situation has become more acute. But as the largest African-based fertilizer company, I can tell you that for some time we have seen a growing demand for fertilizer to meet the needs of African farmers. Many of the roots of the current crisis trace back to the COVID pandemic, when we saw significant shifts in demand and significant supply chain disruptions. Both of these trends have been exacerbated by drought, by pests, and of course by climate change. We have been working through this period to get fertilizer into farmers' hands so they can produce our food. We see this as a responsibility. In fact, it is a very special responsibility for OCP. There are three macronutrients most essential to provide nutrition to plants: potassium, designated as K, nitrogen, designated as N, and phosphorus, designated as P. And OCP is headquartered in Morocco, where we are stewards of 70% of the world's phosphate reserves that produce P. It's estimated the Moroccan reserves would last for several hundreds of years, and to make them last as long as possible, we, as the responsible custodian that we pride ourselves to be, are taking several measures to prolong that stable source of supply. These steps include improving the efficiency of mining, improving the application of fertilizer, preventing soil erosion and agricultural runoff by promoting no-till farming, and promoting precision application and the 4R stewardship principles that Alberta alluded to. These are commitments we have been making at OCP for a long time, investing in farmer training, regularly improving our operations to be more efficient in the use of phosphate, but also through our use of clean energy and water. Actually, about a third of the water that we consume for our industrial operations comes from non-conventional sources, and about 90% of the electricity that we use is clean. Today, I'd like to share some additional commitments that we are making at this very particular important time. Firstly, OCP is committed to accelerating its planned 3 million ton capacity expansion in response to demand growth in Africa, in Europe, in South America, and in Asia, and to keep pace with future anticipated global demand increases. We're also planning to add 10% to our output of fertilizers this year to help increase global capacity. There is an immediate need, and we will accelerate our efforts to meet that demand to the best of our ability. This won't solve the challenges of sourcing ammonia or potash, but it will move the needle on phosphorus, and it will help ensure against future shortages. We all must be aware that if farmers cut back on fertilizer this year due to costs or shortages, they are literally mining their soils. They are not replacing the nutrients that the crops are taking out, which means that they will need more fertilizer in the coming years. Soil health and soil quality is essential. So we need to do our best to supply the right fertilizers and encourage farmers to use them at the right rates and apply them properly in the soils in right places and at the right time. These 4R principles are indeed essential for efficient and environmentally effective use of fertilizers at the farm level. All this underpins farmers' ability to feed people. Another commitment that we have made is to take steps to ensure that Africa is getting its due share of fertilizer. We dedicate about a fifth of our fertilizer output to meet African demand. We have seen that sub-Saharan countries have suffered particularly during COVID, and we have taken every step to ensure that they get their allotted volumes in a context of global scarcity. We offer Africa what it needs and place a priority on serving this market. Of course, we also work to serve other global markets, but approximately 1/5 of our supply, like I said, is dedicated to Africa. Moreover, by dedicating most of our NPKs and our NPS to Africa, we ensure that African farmers have access to not only P, but also to N, to K, and to sulfur, to S, in the context of global shortages. I'll be frank, African farmers face high costs of transportation and are highly cost sensitive. And we do our part to supply African demand even when there is considerable pressure on pricing. We are African and we stand by our African farmers. These measures cannot address all the forces that are accelerating global prices, but we at least are addressing accessibility, and we are working to increase supply to meet demand. I can tell you, in these difficult times, we're also committed to speaking to Africa's leaders and doing our best to support governments in supplying fertilizers to their farmers. We can't change the increase in demand, but we are doing and we will continue to do our best to increase supply in response to the increased demand. Our logistics teams are doing their utmost to get product delivered, although often delivery in Africa is complex due to less than ideal infrastructure. That last mile of delivery can be a challenge. And we know leaders in Africa are working on infrastructure investments with international support. These infrastructure investments are so essential, and we do hope that all of you with us here today will think about the importance of that investment over the long term. I can assure you all that as an African company, we are doing and we will continue to do our best to be part of the solution and to respond to the needs of African farmers. The situation on the continent is serious. The situation in the world is serious. And that is why we are making these commitments now.
What is your organization doing to make fertilizer affordable? There's also a question on how big is your market and are you present in African countries?
Okay, so let me take probably the first one about affordability. As you know, prices are made by the market, and prices are the result, are the outcome of a global supply-demand balance. So what we are doing as a company is to do our share on the supply side. The price hikes that we have seen recently, as Alsbeta exhaustively explained, are a result of several different factors that compounded over the past few months. But one of the main factors, in my view, is the supply shortage. And so what we can do as one responsible player in this industry is to do everything we can to bring as much supply as possible online. As I mentioned in my remarks, we are planning to bring this year 10% more output compared to last, but we are most importantly accelerating our capex expansion as the subject matter experts in the industry know. We had announced a capex expansion of 3 extra million tons a few years ago, and we are doing everything we possibly can to accelerate it and to bring it online as soon as possible. And are we present in African countries? Absolutely, you bet. Like I said, about a fifth of our output is dedicated to African countries. So that's makes up of a bit more than 2 million tons, 2.2, 2.3, depending on the year. And we plan to grow much more than that. And like I said, as we are growing, we continue to dedicate about a fifth of our output to that continent, and we think it's one that will grow quite impressively over the next few years. It has huge potential. And if the right infrastructure investments happen, like I also mentioned in my remarks, it can, I mean, as you know, it has the majority of arable lands. And so it is one region that will require a lot that will capture a lot of fertilizer over the next few years, particularly with the demographical growth that, as Beta mentioned, will be 10 billion soon, and we all need to eat, and Africa is going to have a big role to play in solving that equation.
There's a question about how both OCP and IFA can contribute to improved crop productivity and food security in Africa, specifically in this case in Mozambique, while creating demand for fertilizer use. Is there a window of collaboration in the face of this crisis, not only for improving fertilizer use, but also testing innovation on the fertilizer industry in Africa? And many thanks to Ricardo de Jesus for that question.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks to Ricardo for this question. So what we know from our data is that Africa uses a lot less fertilizer than other parts of the world, and it is reflected in the yields that farmers are getting from their land plots. So what is absolutely essential is few things. First of all, it is about farmer education, and many companies, fertilizer companies, but others as well, are doing a lot of work in farmer education. And the technology that one needs to consider there is the widespread availability of cellular phones, which can be used as an education tool to do that. A number of companies that work with us at IFA have developed their own apps in Africa to help farmers. The second part that is essential, and there's a couple of questions on the chat there, it's financing, right? So when financing is needed, and now it's needed for sure, because prices are higher, it is essential for banks to step in. And so we are working actively to encourage the World Bank Group, IFC, African Development Bank, to come in and provide emergency finance to distributors and dealers in Africa, because this is the missing piece right now in the ability to get the fertilizer to the farmer. And last but not least, we all have to do it sustainably, and we need to really focus on the maximum potential nutrient use efficiency. So when that farmer applies fertilizer, it has to be good quality, it has to have known properties, and ideally the farmer would know what kind of soil she has, and therefore what kind of fertilizer would be optimal. And I know some of the companies, including OCP, is doing soil testing so that we increase precision of the application of those fertilizers. When it comes to Mozambique, I mentioned this is one of the more vulnerable countries going forward because a lot of imports happen from the affected regions of Europe, and also a fair number of calories do come from wheat, which is now more scarce, less available. So it's going to be a country under stress, according to our calculations, and I think it's very important to be able to provide products, whether it's fertilizer or grains, and then also financing to be able to develop that. So on IFA's part, as a trade association, it is active engagement with multilateral financiers on the continent who can provide this kind of financing.
Fertilizer is indeed key for productivity, but we know that the biggest investors in African agriculture are mainly smallholder farmers and family farmers lacking financing. In most African countries, the biggest fertilizer supplier is the government or the national the national buying facilities. What is the opportunity to make sure that there is more access to finance for smallholders to be able to participate?
I think it's a very good question, because what is happening, what we are seeing globally in the financial markets is a pullback from commodity trades. Why? Because of risk aversion, and also because the balance sheets of the sector are very stretched with the higher prices of commodities, all commodities, energy, food, etc., etc. So we are seeing a pullback globally, and then we're seeing including from Africa. So when commercial banks pull back, what's the next step? The next step is to go to local commercial banks. And here one can think about structures such as guarantees from the local commercial banks to the agro dealers, so that they can still get that product and deliver it to that small farm. As the question was rightly structured, that a lot of it is done through government distribution, but in many countries in Africa, it's actually smaller distributors and dealers, which are private sector companies, that are delivering that. So when it comes to governments, they can obviously get their financing through the national budgets, but I think it's more relevant to make sure that smaller distributors and dealers get the finance from local financial institutions. And the third level of support, if they cannot get that from a local financial institution, there is a role, very strong role, for multilateral development banks. And whether it's local multilaterals such as African Development Bank, or even Africa, some other African trade finance corporations on the continent, or whether it's the World Bank Group and others, I think there is a strong role for them to play, both as a financiers and sometimes even as guarantors. So that's from my perspective. But now that I know, you must know a lot about it because you had a financing through the African Development Bank facility. So maybe you can talk about that. Over to you.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alberta. Probably the two projects that come to mind when we talk about how, what can the finance sector do to help the increase the fertilizer consumption in tandem with governments. I want to talk about two models that OCP tried, is actually today working on, which are the Ethiopian and the Nigerian projects. Because even particularly for projects that are more prone to project financing, it is much more helpful for also financial institutions to step in when the offtake is almost guaranteed, and when the raw material sourcing is also secured. Why these two projects? In Ethiopia, the JV that we've set up with the local authorities would use phosphoric acid that would come from Morocco, and would use Ethiopian natural gas to make its own customized fertilizers that are best suited to the Ethiopian soil. And the Nigerian project scheme is comparable to that one, where we would export phosphoric acid to Nigeria, and they would use their local resource of natural gas to make customized fertilizers using ammonia, urea, and what have you. And I do think that montages like these make projects more financeable. You have, local guaranteed offtake. You have secured access to raw materials, and so it is a public-private partnership scheme that I would assume are more appealing to financial institutions. I'm talking about these two, and of course that wouldn't solve the whole problem for Africa, because exactly like you rightfully pointed out, Alzbeta, we have one has to, and the financial sector in general has to step in to help other parts of the ecosystem that are not, backed by such strong balance sheets. like the small distributors, like you talked about, like the importers that are very much exposed to the global risk of rise in commodity prices. But I wanted to mention these two because I think that they help tick a lot of points. They are bankable projects. They help increase the local content. They are, in my view, more sustainable than others because, you know, the smaller circuits, you produce where you consume. And so that's what I wanted to add to your very rich intervention.
Commissioner Sacco's special advisor, Professor Jerome, who assists the Commissioner for Rural Economy, Agriculture, and the African Union Commission, has been able to join successfully, and he is going to bring us some greetings from her. We are still working to solve the other technical issues. But thank you very much, Professor Jerome. Over to you.
Apologies from Ambassador Sacco. She's actually on mission in Nigeria and trying to connect. Progress against hunger had been made, but lost between 2014 and 2019 period. The most recent estimate shows that about 346 million people in Africa, which is about a quarter of the population, are undernourished and facing severe food insecurity. This is up from 286 million in 2021. That is, if you compare both figures, you have an increase of about 100 million in just 1 year between 2021 and 2022. Our third Carden primary report indicates that only one country is on track towards meeting the ending hunger goal of the Malabo Declaration by 2025, and that country incidentally is Rwanda. Like the first speaker rightly alluded to, we have several overlapping factors responsible for this. The very first one is conflict. Second one is climate change, economic slowdowns and downturns, as well as rising food prices. And now the Russian-Ukraine crisis, which is compounding the adverse situation. That is not to talk of the COVID-19 pandemic that we have been contending with in the past 2 years. Well, in addition to hunger, millions of Africans suffer from widespread micronutrient deficiencies, while overweight and obesity are already significant public health concerns in many countries. In all of this, women are disproportionately vulnerable to food insecurity, as well as the economic and environmental shocks. So we should have that in mind if we are looking for solutions. Just to summarize, African food systems, while changing as a result of population growth, rapid urbanization, and the youthful population, remains critically constrained in almost all its key components. Whether you talk of food production and productivity, for instance, which remains uncompetitive and grossly below potential in providing decent income for farmers, herders, and fishers, as well as associated frontline entrepreneurs. Despite agriculture being the mainstay of Africa's economy, accounting for about 16% of the GDP and 60% of the workforce, the continent continues to be a net importer of food, spending about $43 billion annually on food imports every year. And this could reach 110 million in 2025, if unchecked. That is in spite of the fact that Africa has about 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. The truth is that Africa should be able to feed itself and indeed feed the rest of the world. To quickly look at the second part of the question, what we can do to address the food insecurity, well, there are a lot of solutions, including, I know OCP will be interested in the fertilizer dimension, but we'll talk about that shortly. We need to take the opportunity created by this overlapping crisis, which I read out now, to modernize African agriculture and build a food system that can withstand future shocks. Hopefully, I think if I still have time to comment in the second part, I can go into details in that. The second part with that, we need essential interventions, which should target increased investment in research and extension to improve yields, especially of nutritious food, and to diffuse the adoption of modern technologies, because it's not growing pace the way we want. I mean, those are where issues of fertilizer consumption, mechanization, and what have you will come in. Production must also be intensified in a sustainable manner, and we need interventions to improve land governance, empower women to reduce the gender gap, reduce post-harvest losses, and lower transaction costs by investing in road networks, transportation, storage, and market infrastructure. To sum all of this up, now that we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, it is an opportunity for us to use it to boost agricultural imports in Africa. Finally, since we have, because of time constraints, government policy is very, very crucial. It must promote access to nutritious food through social protection, poverty reduction, and income inequality. If you look at the last biannual review report, unfortunately, you find that only 4 countries in Africa met the target of allocating 10% of their budget to agriculture. This is not good enough. Increasingly, we have to use the opportunity of this crisis to step up investment in that particular sector.
What do you think are policy responses we need most right now to ensure food security in Africa?
The policy responses needed are those that should target the primary drivers of insecurity in Africa, as I read out. Whether you talk of conflict, climate change, and all these overlapping crises that are beginning to be a manifestation of our food systems. For climate change, we need to begin to intensify and step up climate smart agriculture. It's already in practice, but it's not at scale. We need to boost it, because whether you like it or not, climate change is beginning to be part of us, in spite of the fact that we contribute less than 4% of global GHG emissions, but we are bearing the brunt of climate change. So we need more investment in that area. The second one is to mitigate conflict. The African Union silencing the guns must be stepped up. I mean, there are a lot of conflicts everywhere, whether you talk of the Sahel and now the Horn of Africa. We need to look for ways of mitigating, ending those conflicts so that we can intensify our food production. We also need, given the fact that conflict is a major foundation of food security, not just in Africa, but externally. I mean, talk, for example, this current ongoing Russian-Ukraine crisis. We need to look for a way of stopping that war. You find that African commitment to the peaceful resolution of the Russia-Ukraine crisis is evident by the recent visit by the chairperson of the African Union Commission, as the president of Senegal, to Russia to seek for a political solution to end the conflict, and also appeal for the unrestricted movement of cereals, fertilizers, and other products through the Black Sea port, which has been under tremendous impact because of the Russian-Ukraine crisis. However, there are local solutions which are ongoing, which we need to build upon. Just last month, to mitigate the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the African Development Bank, in collaboration with the African Union, launched a big facility, a 1.5 billion facility to boost food production in Africa over the next 4 cropping seasons. These are ways. I mean, if you look at the details of that particular plan, there's a fertilizer component. I'm sure OCP will be happy to be part of that. In preparation for the UN Food Systems Summit, because of the various challenges which we have in our food systems in Africa, the AU, working with other NEPAD and the UNECA, through a very consultative process, developed an African common position for the summit. The report, we drew substantially from the 49 national consultations that took place in Africa, presented 43 game-changing solutions along the 5 action tracks of the UN Food Summit. They are wide-ranging and include micronutrient fortification of staple foods, better food safety, improved maternal child nutrition, and what have you. I mean, they provide the report which we need. But the challenge now is that we need to implement that particular report, even though the Food Systems Summit has ended. So part of what we are doing in the African Union is to work with the NEPAD to see how we can assist countries to implement the game-changing solutions that they brought up in the Food Systems Summit. If Ambassador Sako were to be talking, there's one point she will make, so let me make sure I make that point. The lessons from all of this is that food sovereignty is no longer an option in Africa, but the way to go. We need to intensify action to reduce importation of foods. We should be beginning to grow what we eat. Like Ambassador Sako will tell you that if you look at the food basket of the rural African population, many of them do not consume bread. It's mainly in North Africa that bread is a staple food. Let us grow our cassava and our chapati and other foods that we eat.
How can we make sure that supply chains are getting fertilizer into African hands? You talked about policy responses, and very well, might I add, but what about supply chains?
Invariably, you find that 22 African countries import fertilizer from Russia, Ukraine, or both of them. We've had supply chain disruptions, not just as a result of the Russian-Ukraine crisis, beginning from the COVID-19 period, and they are still massive. So the point we are making at the African Union is that in line with being self-sufficient, I mean, I already talk of plans by the African Development Bank to assist African countries to put more, to break those loopholes and put fertilizer into more hands. So also the effort to ameliorate the Russian-Ukraine crisis so that importation can resume. But in the medium to long term, we are more interested in what happens in the medium to long term. In line with being self-sufficient in food, we should begin to produce more of our fertilizers in Africa. In that respect, the good news is that looking at the terrain is the last 3 to 4 years, fertilizer production is beginning to expand in Africa. Take the group OCP, for example, your group. OCP in Morocco is a world-leading phosphate fertilizer producer with presence in at least 20 African countries. And it's still widening its reach to different countries. He supplied more than 2.5 million tons of fertilizer to Africa in the year 2020. Well, I'm sure it might be more than that. So we need to intensify very many of these transitions. The good news also is that what many people don't know about is that on 22nd March 2022, Dangote's 2.5 billion fertilizer plant was opened in Lagos, Nigeria. It started production. The 3 million tons per year capacity is the world's 3rd biggest fertilizer plant and 2nd biggest producer of urea-based fertilizer in the entire globe. With the coming on stream of this Dangote fertilizer plant, Nigeria has commenced exportation of urea-based fertilizer to even the US, India, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. I mean, increasingly, we are meeting the demand. There are several other small known plants. I'm not talking about the Dorema now, which the OCP Group is happening to build in Nigeria. We also have one in Zimbabwe that the African Union is being called upon to take over. So this crisis situation is an opportunity for us to sit down and get our ass together, pertaining to how we can meet the supplies of this supply plane. And the opportunity we can use to do that is that plans are ongoing to hold the second Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit in the last quarter of next year. Hopefully, it will address very many of these issues, including marketing, pricing, and what have you.
So here I go with it. Policy inconsistencies and tariffs between countries contribute substantially to higher fertilizer and food costs in Africa. What is the African Union doing to support the regional response to the current crisis and harmonize efforts across countries?
Well, I agree with the person asking the question that policy inconsistency is a major challenge. At the African Union, mainly what we do is to put policies in place. We are not responsible for implementation. Policies are actually implemented at the national level. The only thing we can do, like if you look at biannual review report, for the first time, the last report in which the head of state presented this year, we included fertilizer. So you will see to what extent policies are consistent there. I mean, we can only advise and I help countries to correct very many of these distortions. But there's not much which you can do from Addis Ababa here. We are not a police force. Thank you.
Professor, policy inconsistencies and tariffs between countries contribute substantially to higher fertilizer and food costs in Africa. What is the AU doing to support regional response to the current crisis and harmonize the efforts across countries? Perhaps to Elzbieta, what could the fertilizer industry do to bring down the cost of delivery and logistics from the current approximately 50% of farm gate price? We've also seen a question from a number of people from Ethiopia talking about just how important this is on the ground to them as people who need to help produce crops. And there's also a question about the 4R project, which Nada, I believe you mentioned, talking about, what does that mean on the ground? And then finally, back to the professor, also a question about what is the monitoring mechanism of the African Union to encourage countries to meet their own commitments? And sorry, and one more has popped up. So you'll have lots to work from. African Development Bank as a financial institution should be supporting this type of work in Africa. Do they support entrepreneurs who have innovation to manufacture fertilizers and also distribute across Africa? And while you were talking about it earlier, there were several questions about what can be done to accelerate fertilizer manufacture in Africa.
There's a couple of questions on the chat. Logistics is clearly a function of infrastructure, and infrastructure in Africa is a key topic that we need to think about and think through, and most importantly, keep investing. So what needs to happen for us to lower the cost of logistics on the continent is to just invest, and invest in a major way, the way how we haven't done in the past, and we need to do it today. Because projects such as Dangote in Nigeria, but also in Dorama a few years prior to that, they need to have ways to deliver that product to the farmer. So it's not enough to build a manufacturing facility. We have to actually engage infrastructure investors to help deliver that product. And I think this is absolutely critical. The other thing I'd like to, and this is not an IFA purview, this is something that needs to be done by investors on the continent, and also to a degree by companies that are investing in manufacturing facilities, maybe doing joint ventures on the infrastructure. What has become very clear over the past few months is that infrastructure is actually a limiting point for delivery of both foods and fertilizer. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the fact that Black Sea ports are by and large closed restricts delivery of food to many parts of North Africa and restricts delivery of fertilizers to everywhere in the world. So infrastructure became absolutely mission critical for all of us in the industry. So if I were to make one call to action, this sector, infrastructure, needs fundamentally more investments that we have been doing in the past. I'll pick up one more question from the chat. I think it came from Ronald Vargas, our partner at the FAO, on sustainability. I think what is critical is that resources in Africa are going to get used. And if you have a gas flaring opportunities in Nigeria, which can be converted into a product that can be used, this is absolutely mission critical for development, say, of Nigeria, but also for the environmental impact that you're mitigating because you're using flared gas for production of commodities. So we all have to do it sustainably, and we have to decarbonize as much as possible in the factory, and then as much as possible through farmers' education on the farm.
I'll take it from here, Elzbieta, just to probably complete a few points that you said about the role of infrastructure to bring down the cost of logistics throughout the continent. And indeed, I agree with you, it's all a matter of investment. But I want to push it one step further to understand what's the bottleneck to that investment. And I think one of the big bottlenecks to that investment is volume. No one wants to, it's much harder to invest when you have very little visibility of how much volume will eventually traffic through that infrastructure investment. And that's what I would probably want to emphasize a bit more about what we've done in Africa over the past 5 years. As Professor Jerome mentioned, we went from 200, 300 kilotons to about 4.5 2 years ago. And we're looking to hopefully be able to export much more than that with our capacity expansion plan, and hopefully with the increasing demand and African farms going from somewhere around 15 kilos to 10 times more than that. But basically, what there's one thing that we've done a couple of years ago is to go ahead and dedicate a portion of our input there. And I think what that gives is visibility for all players of the ecosystem, the financial sector, the governments, the other actors of the value chain, and they understand that they can count of that much more volume going through their circuits. And I think that de-risks quite substantially infrastructure investments, and it helps contribute to solving the way larger infrastructure problem that Africa is suffering a great deal from. And indeed, if we achieve to liberate, to incentivize more investments in infrastructure in Africa, then quite naturally, arithmetically, the cost of logistics will go down, and eventually the cost of fertilizer at farm gate will drop that much more, and there you have the virtuous circle of by dedicating more volume, eventually more volume will be consumed locally and hopefully help achieve that dream of having Africa first feed itself and feed the world. The way we understand for our is ultimately customization. Customization is the name of the game. There is no, our industry, and I think you'll agree, Elzbieta, has been quite commoditized over, since 100 years ago, I want to say. And the whole point here is the future trend to continue doing our part in feeding the world and doing it sustainably goes through customization. Giving the soil and giving the crop exactly what it needs, no more, no less. And in order for all actors of the value chain, starting by producers, in order for us to be able to target that collective challenge, well, we need to understand exactly what that soil and what that crop needs, and so it goes. I mean, the solution will necessarily mobilize the efforts of farmers, of product innovators, of pretty much everyone working in the sector to customize the right combination of macronutrients and of micronutrients and apply them at the right place of the parcel and at the right time. And that's, I think that's what that's what our audience would need to take away from the discussion.
I need to just wholeheartedly agree with you that 4R is the way to go, right time, right nutrients. And I think, but the critical piece that we are missing is helping farmer understand what she needs to design and deliver the best crop, either for her own needs or for markets or for exports or whatever she may be doing. So that piece of educating the farmer is going to be critical to deliver optimal yields. But you're absolutely right. It is about perfect nutrient for that particular farm, for that particular plot of land. And I think as an industry, we are very much moving from the commodity side of it to much more customized plant nutrition, and the technology is actually helping us deliver that. Thank you.
What is a monitoring mechanism of African Union to encourage the countries to meet at least their commitments?
Let me start with the one on fertilizer usage. The first African Fertilizer Summit was held more than about 20 years ago. And that stipulated a yardstick on how to move forward with fertilizer production and consumption in Africa. The one I can remember clearly is that it stipulated that at least by 2015, fertilizer consumption in Africa should be 50 kg, at least by farmer. This goal has not been attained. At least the OCP produces a very nice African fertilizer map every year. The last map, when I look at it, I mean, consumption is just around 25 kilograms per farmer, which is abysmally low. It is because of all this crisis that we are trying to hold the second fertilizer. This time, I repeat, not just fertilizer, because we do realize that soil, the texture of the soil has a lot to do with fertilizer. So it's now a combination of African fertilizer and soil summit. I mean, we're working with Asbeta and others, but OCP, everybody in arranging this summit. It will hold next year, where concretely we'll look at all the major manifestations of the inefficiencies, whether from marketing or what have you. But let us give some credit, because somebody was asking what the ADB was doing. After the first fertilizer summit, I mean, ADB put in place, I don't know the full name now, but we just call it AFFM, the Africa Fertilizer something, which is in charge of monitoring fertilizer, making sure that fertilizer is well utilized. I mean, they've been going all over the continent. If I remember very well, even last year, they had a major summit for Southern Africa region, bringing producers and everybody together, trying to increase fertilizer usage. I know very many of this is now because the chairperson of the board is Ambassador Joseph Asako. So much is being done in terms of policy on how we can step up fertilizer production and consumption, removing all the constraints, including the marketing, not just production constraints. Having said that on fertilizer, so just give us some patience. I'm sure by next year, by the time we hold the second African Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit, I mean, you're going to see a lot of changes in terms of how we're moving forward. On the question of monitoring implementation, I want to cast your mind back that our head of states have already agreed on a policy. There's a framework for the agri sector, which is the Common African Agri Policy, the CADEP, in short, what we call CADEP, which in 2014 transformed into the Malabo Declarations, where we have 7 concrete areas where we are monitoring their performance. In the spirit, I mean, the 7th declaration there has to do with mutual accountability. So taking that forward, we now prepare a report every 2 years telling countries where they are in terms of moving towards the Malabo Declarations, which is supposed to end by 2025. The first one now is reducing poverty. What are they doing? Boosting inter-African trade by at least 3%. We monitor these 7 areas Every 2 years, consistently we've done that. So Africa Union have been able to produce 3 reports. So just log on to the Africa Union website and check the report of the CADEP Malabo declarations. It's very consistent. So you can find where your country is, whether they are moving along the path or something. In addition to that, our CADEP team, they all move around the countries, helping them to correct, to implement very many of the places where they think they are not doing very well. We also encourage learning, peer learning among African countries. You go and learn from a country who is doing well in a particular area. These are some of the activities which we are doing with our flagship program, which CADEP is one of the flagship programs of the African Union. But unfortunately, in terms of progress, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, only one country is making the movement, is going to achieve by 2025 the 7 declarations that we are looking at. That is not to say there is no improvement. At least the good news about the last report is that at least 36 countries made some improvements in different areas. But overall, Africa is not on track to meet those declarations, as well as the SDG goals, particularly SDG goal 2. So we need to use the opportunity of this crisis now to reinvent African agriculture.
I'm certain that I can carry the spirit of Nada's comments, which were to say, thank you very much, Professor Jerome. Thank you for standing in. The commissioner has sent a note again apologizing for her difficulties in connection. And I have to say she was very ably represented by you, and the depth of the conversation and your points were so well made about the need for Africa to take a firm hold of this and focus on its own agricultural sector. And Elsbeta, I know for certain that everyone was compelled by the clarity of your remarks at the beginning that framed the situation so ably. And it's so good to see that the industry as a whole is responding to the complexity of this situation. And we wish all of you well in achieving that. And I know Nada is very frustrated by her inability to add her own voice of thanks right now to this moment. But thank you for all of us in the audience, Nada, for the great job you did explaining, and to OCP for committing to keep African fertilizers as a vital and stable part of your own existing supply, and for scaling up that supply. These are huge commitments in this moment, and Africa needs to be such an important part of it, and having OCP there helps so much. And thank you to our audience. The chat was so rich. The questions and answers were so rich. Please stay tuned to the importance of food security. And we thank you all so very much. And we look forward to seeing you at a future OCP Cultivating Conversations in July. We'll be talking about soil health. With best wishes, everyone. Thank you all.